I spent 5 years listening to muffled laughter every time I walked into the meeting room with my curly hair loose. 5 years of being called the girl with the different hair by people who barely knew my full name. They thought I didn't notice the glances, the whispered comments near the coffee machine, the jokes disguised as compliments. "Wow, you're so brave," they'd say, as if wearing my own hair was an act of rebellion and not simply existing. I was 53 years old when I joined that company. I wasn't an intern. I wasn't a trainee. I had a resume, experience, projects that had saved entire departments in other companies. But none of that mattered when you're a black woman with natural hair in an office where all the other women had flawless hair straightening treatments or blonde hair that looked like it came straight out of a magazine. To them, I was just a quota hire, a decorative piece of diversity. Marcella, the marketing manager, always made a point of touching my hair without asking permission. "Oh, how cute, it looks like cotton candy," she'd say in front of everyone, and I'd smile. I smiled because I needed the job. I smiled because I had bills to pay. I smiled because I learned early on that women like me have to swallow a lot to survive in spaces that were never made for us. Rodrigo, the sales director, called me our Dona Flor every time I entered his office. I don't know if he thought he was being nice or if he really didn't see the problem of reducing a professional to a soap opera character. But the worst part wasn't the direct comments. The worst part was the silence. That icy silence when I presented an idea and everyone looked at the ceiling, at their cell phones, anywhere but me. And then Pedro, the 20-something intern, would repeat the exact same idea 5 minutes later, and everyone would applaud as if he had invented the wheel. I saw my reports being ignored while identical proposals signed by white colleagues became a priority on the board's agenda. Have you ever felt invisible in the middle of a room full of people? Not truly invisible because they see you. They see your hair, your skin color, your age. But they see you as if you were a piece of furniture. Something that takes up space but has no voice. Something decorative, perhaps necessary for the company website photo, but never essential, never decisive. I was the woman they needed to hire to show they were modern, but whom they would never take seriously. Until the day the CEO of the parent company, a man I had never met in person, requested an urgent meeting with the Brazilian board. And he specifically asked that I be present. Not Pedro. Not Marcella. Not Rodrigo. Me. The woman with the cotton candy hair. Dona Flor. Quota hiring. At that moment, while everyone looked at me trying to understand what was happening, I finally let my smile fall. Because the time had come for them to discover who I really was. No one asked me why I accepted that invitation. No one seemed curious about why an international CEO would request my presence at a strategic meeting when, until that moment, I was barely invited to team lunches. They just looked at each other with that expression I knew so well. That mixture of confusion and discomfort that people used to being in control feel when something deviates from the expected script. I saw Marcella cross her arms and tilt her head, as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Rodrigo fiddled with his phone more forcefully than necessary, his fingers tapping the screen as if he wanted to pierce it. And Pedro, that boy who repeated my ideas as if they were his own, simply stared at me as if I had stolen something that belonged to him. The invitation, the attention, the spotlight. But the truth is, I knew exactly why I was being called. And they, even without wanting to admit it, were also beginning to suspect something. That silent fear that appears when you realize you've underestimated someone for too long. When you laugh at someone for so long that you forget to check who's really laughing last. I spent those 5 years observing. Not just surviving. Observing. Every skipped meeting was a lesson on how that company really worked. Every stolen idea showed me the system's weaknesses. Every joke about my hair taught me exactly who the people around me were. And while they thought I was just another employee trying to fit in, I was mapping every flaw, every loophole, every opportunity they were too arrogant to see. Do you know what the advantage of being invisible is? Nobody watches you. Nobody controls your movements. Nobody questions when you stay late at the office or when you ask for access to old files to better organize your work. They thought I was being dedicated, that I was trying to prove my worth. And I was, just not in the way they imagined. While Marcella was posting photos of expensive lunches and Rodrigo was bragging about closing deals I had structured, I was gathering evidence. Numbers that didn't add up. Emails that contradicted official reports. Decisions made based on information that, curiously, always reached the board with my signature erased and someone else's name in its place. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to wait for the right moment. And that moment arrived when the parent company decided to conduct a full audit of the Brazilian subsidiary. Not a routine audit. A thorough investigation into performance, strategic decisions, and, most importantly, who was actually generating results. They wanted to understand why some departments were thriving while others were collapsing. They wanted names. They wanted those responsible. They wanted the truth. That's when my name came up. Not because I asked for it. Not because I promoted myself. But because the data doesn't lie. And when you have 5 years of documented work, of projects that saved millions even when others took the credit, of strategies that worked despite being ignored in official meetings, the numbers speak for themselves. Loud, clear, undeniable. So many people stay here following each revelation because they know this story isn't just mine. It's the story of everyone who has ever been underestimated for looking different, for being the wrong age, for not fitting the mold, for daring to exist in spaces that were built to exclude them. So when the CEO's assistant sent that email scheduling the meeting and listing me as an essential participant, I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just saved the message and went on with my day. Because I knew that was just the beginning. The real moment was yet to come. And this time there was no way they could pretend not to see me. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 10 in the morning. The main room, the one overlooking the avenue with a glass table that reflected everything like a mirror. I arrived 15 minutes early. Not out of anxiety. It was strategic. I wanted to see everyone's faces when they walked in and found me already seated, organized, with my documents open and my laptop on. I wanted them to feel that discomfort of arriving last in their own territory. Marcella was the first. She stopped at the door when she saw me, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before her expression recovered. She greeted me with a cold nod and sat on the other side of the table, as far away from me as possible. Rodrigo came in soon after, his tie crooked, sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes and murmured a good morning that sounded more like a question. Pedro came last, dragging his feet, with that posture of someone going to their own trial but still pretending to be in control. Nobody asked anything. Nobody dared to verbalize what everyone was thinking. Why is she here? What does the CEO want with her? What have we lost? At 10 o'clock sharp, the door opened. It wasn't just the CEO. There were 3 people. Him, a tall man with gray hair and a posture that filled the entire space even when standing still. The chief auditor, an Asian woman with thin glasses who carried a tablet as if it were a weapon. And the international legal director, Brazilian, but who had lived in New York for 15 years and spoke Portuguese with a mixed American accent. The CEO looked directly at me and smiled. Not that corporate smile you see in magazines. A genuine smile. Smile of recognition. As if he were seeing an old acquaintance again after a long time. He extended his hand and said my full name. Not the girl with the different hair. Not our Donna floor. Name. With my last name. With respect. I shook that hand and felt something I hadn't felt in that office for 5 years. Dignity. He sat at the head of the table and got straight to the point. He said that headquarters had identified serious inconsistencies in the reports sent by the Brazilian branch. Projects attributed to certain people that had actually been developed by others. Strategic decisions credited to directors who merely signed off on pre-prepared documents. Impressive results that appeared without clear authorship, as if they had sprung from nowhere. The auditor opened the tablet and began projecting onto the screen in the room. Spreadsheets, emails, everything organized chronologically. Each project had 2 versions. The official version, with the name of the person who received the credit, and the real version with records of who actually did the work. Digital signatures. Metadata that doesn't lie. My name appeared everywhere. Every single one. The silence in the room was so heavy I could hear Rodrigo's rapid breathing. Marcella was pale, her fingers gripping the pen so tightly I thought she was going to break it. Pedro stared at the screen as if he were watching a horror movie where he was the monster. The CEO continued. He said that this wasn't just a matter of ethics. It was intellectual theft. It was institutional sabotage. It was a pattern of behavior that jeopardized the credibility of the entire company. And that the parent company wouldn't tolerate it. Then he turned to me and asked the question I'd been waiting to ask for 5 years. Why didn't you ever report it? I took a deep breath. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew that answer would define everything. I could have screamed. I could have cried. I could have unleashed all the accumulated anger. But women like me learn early on that true strength isn't in the volume of your voice. It's in the clarity of your words. I said that making accusations without proof would be called victimhood. That complaining without structure would be seen as incompetence. That black women, especially older women, don't have the right to be heard only through words. We need evidence, documents, witnesses who cannot be ignored. So I gathered everything, patiently, silently. While they laughed at my hair and stole my work, I built the case that would destroy them. The CEO nodded slowly, as if each of my words confirmed something he already suspected. He looked at Marcella, then Rodrigo, then Pedro, and he said just one sentence. You have until the end of the day to submit your written defenses. But we all knew there was no possible defense. The numbers were there. The truth was exposed. And for the first time in that office, I wasn't invisible. After the CEO ended the meeting, nobody left immediately. It was as if the ground had turned into quicksand, and any sudden movement could sink them even further. Marcella closed her laptop with a sharp click, the sound echoing through the empty room. Rodrigo ran his hand over his face several times, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. Pedro simply sat there, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. I was the first to stand up. I didn't run. I didn't flee. I walked to the door with the same calm as always, that calm they had mistaken for resignation for years. But before leaving I turned around. Just for a second. Enough to meet each of their gazes. And in that instant I saw, not anger, not hatred, something worse. Shame. That deep shame that comes when you realize you were too small to recognize the greatness of another person. I went back to my desk and continued my day. I answered emails. I finalized reports. I drank my coffee from my usual mug. But something had changed in the air. People looked at me differently. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. With respect. That silent respect that doesn't need words because it's built on undeniable facts. In the hallway, the new intern, a black girl with long braids whom I always saw eating lunch alone, stopped me. She didn't say anything. She just smiled. A small, discreet smile, but one that carried a whole universe of meaning. As if she knew. As if somehow the news had already spread to the invisible corners of the office, those places where people who are constantly ignored exchange glances and understand each other without needing to speak. It is at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message has touched them. Because this story is not about revenge. Never was. It's about justice. About the moment when the truth finally catches up with the lies and dismantles them piece by piece, without haste, without drama, only with the devastating force of the facts. That afternoon 3 emails arrived. The first was from Marcella. She apologized. Not for the jokes. Not for touching my hair without permission. But for any misunderstanding that might have occurred. Misunderstanding. As if stealing someone's work were a communication accident. I read it and deleted it without replying. The second one was from Rodrigo. Longer. More desperate. He said he always admired me, that he recognized my talent, that he never intended to harm me. Lies wrapped in fear. I could feel the panic between the lines, the terror of losing his job, his reputation, the salary that supported his house in the gated community and his imported car. Blacked out too. The third one was from Pedro. Brief. Just 2 lines. I didn't know it was so serious. I'm sorry. I almost laughed. Didn't know stealing ideas was serious. Didn't know erasing someone's name and replacing it with your own was serious. Or didn't know that one day he would get caught. I didn't respond to any of them. Because the truth is, those apologies weren't for me. They were for themselves. Desperate attempts to soften the blame, to transform years of disrespect into a correctable misunderstanding. But there's no correcting what's been done. There's only consequence. At the end of the day, I received an email from the CEO. He wanted to schedule a private meeting. Just the 2 of us. To discuss my future at the company. Future. That word sounded strange. For 5 years, I didn't have a future there. I had a present. An eternal present of invisibility and disrespect. But now, suddenly I had a future. Accepted the meeting. Not because I needed to, but because I deserved it. I deserved to hear what he had to say. I deserved to occupy that space not as a favor, not as a quota, but as the professional I've always been. As the woman who built results while others built jokes. I left the office that night and the sky was orange. One of those sunsets that seem unreal. They're so beautiful. I stopped on the sidewalk for a moment just watching. And for the first time in a long time, I breathed without carrying a weight on my shoulders. Not because the fight was over, but because finally, after so long being erased, I had come back to life. And what came next wasn't just about me. It was about all the women who were still invisible at their tables. Keeping silent, gathering strength. Waiting for the right moment. 'Cause it always comes. Always. The meeting with the CEO took place the following Monday. Not in the glass room. In his office, a private space on the top floor. With bookshelves full of books that looked like they had actually been read and a huge window that showed the entire city below. He offered me coffee. Not the kind from an automatic machine. Real coffee, served in a porcelain cup, with that aroma that fills the room. I sat in the leather armchair and waited. Not anxiously but curiously. Because for the first time in 5 years, I was in a room where my presence had been requested, not tolerated. He began by saying that he had read all my projects. Not the official summaries. The original files. The complete proposals that I had submitted and that were diluted, modified, republished with other signatures. He said he found brilliant ideas buried in forgotten folders, visionary strategies that could have saved millions if they had been implemented at the right time. But they weren't. 'Cause they came from me. He paused. He looked at me with that expression of someone about to say something important and wanting to make sure they're heard. And then he asked why I had stayed. Why I hadn't left. Why a professional of my caliber had agreed to stay in a place that clearly didn't value me. I could have given a simple answer. I could have said that I needed the salary. That the market was tough. That women my age don't find jobs easily. All of those answers would have been true. But they wouldn't have been complete. The truth is, I stayed because I knew this conversation would happen someday. Not because I'm psychic, but because injustice leaves traces. It always does. And traces eventually lead someone to the source. I just needed to ensure that when that someone arrived, they would find irrefutable proof. Not accusations. Not complaints. Documented, organized facts, impossible to ignore. I told him that. And I saw something change in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something rarer. Recognition. The kind of recognition you give to someone who played chess when everyone thought it was checkers. He leaned back in his chair and got straight to the point. He said that Marcella had been let go. That Rodrigo had been demoted and transferred to another branch, to an administrative position without contact with clients. That Pedro had been fired for cause. And that the company was restructuring its entire Brazilian hierarchy. And then came the question I wasn't expecting. He wanted to know if I would accept leading the department. Not as a manager. As a director. With real authority. With my own team. With a budget and autonomy to implement the strategies I had developed and that had been languishing in digital drawers for years. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence fill the room. Because that silence spoke louder than any hurried words. It said I wasn't desperate. That I wasn't going to accept just anything to get a higher position. That even after everything, I still had enough dignity to judge whether that place deserved my talent. He understood. He stayed quiet. He waited. I asked if the company was willing to make real changes. Not just promote me to appear diverse. But to create an environment where other women like me wouldn't have to keep proof for 5 years to be taken seriously. Where talent would be recognized regardless of skin color, hair type, or age on the document. He said yes. That was exactly why they had done the audit. That the parent company had noticed a toxic pattern repeating itself in several branches, and that Brazil was the most serious case. He said I could have carte blanche to restructure processes, hire people, and change the organizational culture. I looked out the window. Down below, the city was bustling. People rushing to and fro, each carrying their own invisible battles. How many of them were like me? How many were, at that very moment, swallowing humiliations, gathering strength, waiting for their moment? I turned to him and accepted. Not with exaggerated enthusiasm. Not with false modesty. Just with the certainty of someone who always knew he deserved to be there. And that finally, after so long swimming against the current, he would be able to show where the river should truly flow. But as I shook that hand and felt the weight of the new responsibility, I knew the story wasn't over. Because down there, on the floor below, there were still people who had seen Marcella leave with her box of belongings. Who had heard the rumors about Rodrigo. Who knew something big had happened but still didn't fully understand what. And these people were waiting, watching, deciding which side to take. Because every change comes with resistance. And I was about to find out who was truly willing to change and who would try to keep things exactly as they were. My first week as director was silent. Not the silence of respect. It was the silence of waiting. People greeted me in the hallways with measured smiles, glances that lasted half a second less than they should have. There was something in the air, an electric tension that you feel but can't touch. As if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what I was going to do. I didn't do anything. Not immediately. I spent the first few days just observing. Sitting in meetings I didn't even know existed. Reading reports that never reached my old desk. Discovering layer upon layer of decisions made behind closed doors, where the real power circulated while the rest of us pretended to work democratically down there. And it was in that observation that I realized something disturbing. The structure that allowed my work to be stolen for 5 years hadn't been created by Marcela, Rodrigo, or Pedro. They were merely symptoms. The disease was deeper. It was in the invisible processes, in the unwritten dynamics, in that silent code that everyone understood but no one admitted existed. There was Sandra from accounting, who always looked away when I passed by. The same Sandra I saw having lunch with Marcela every week, laughing too loudly, sharing secrets in whispers. There was Fernando, the logistics supervisor, who never greeted me but had the strange habit of showing up at meetings where I was and writing down everything I said. Not because he agreed, but because I was mapping things out, looking for flaws, waiting for the moment to exploit them. I understood then that my promotion hadn't solved anything. It had only changed the game. Before they could ignore me. Now they needed to confront me. And confronting me meant finding ways to discredit me, to prove that I didn't deserve to be there, that my rise had been due to luck or politics or anything but competence. On Thursday, I received an anonymous email. No identifiable sender. Just a short message. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone wants you to succeed here. I read it 3 times. Not with fear. With clarity. Because that message confirmed what I already knew. The battle hadn't ended with the meeting with the CEO. It had simply changed arenas. I scheduled a meeting with the entire team for the following Monday. I didn't tell them what I was going to talk about. I just called them in. Large room, everyone present without exception. When I arrived, the room was in absolute silence. 23 people sat there, looking at me as if I were an enigma they needed to decipher before it was too late. I started by saying that I knew exactly what many were thinking. That I didn't deserve that position. That I had gotten it because of audits, politics, being in the right place at the right time. I said this looking directly into each person's eyes, making it clear that I knew. That I wasn't naive. That I understood the game better than they imagined. And then I did something no one expected. I asked each person in the room to describe a project they had developed in the last 6 months. Something they had created from scratch. Something they could truly call their own. The silence that followed was awkward. Because many there had no answers. They had carried out orders. They had followed manuals. They had signed documents. But to create, to innovate, to take risks, that was uncharted territory. Sandra tried to talk about a quarterly report. I asked if she had proposed any changes to the methodology or simply repeated the format from the previous year. She blushed and mumbled something about following established standards. Fernando mentioned a reorganization of inventory. I asked if the idea had been his or the suppliers who suggested the new system. He looked away. I didn't do this to humiliate anyone. I did it to show the difference between taking up space and creating value. Between being present and making a difference. Because for 5 years I was treated like someone who only took up space. And now, in that room, I was showing everyone that the difference between us wasn't color, age, or appearance. It was substance. I ended the meeting by saying that from that moment on, each person would be judged by what they created, not by what they pretended to be. That I would recognize real talent, regardless of its origin. But that I would also expose mediocrity, no matter how long it had been disguised as competence. I left the room without waiting for a reaction, without looking back. Because true leaders don't need to check if they're being followed. They simply walk in the right direction and trust that whoever should follow will find their way. But as I walked back to my office, I felt the true weight of responsibility, not just for myself, but for all the people who were still invisible, keeping silent, gathering strength. I had opened a door. Now I needed to make sure it didn't close again as soon as I blinked. 2 weeks after the meeting, I started receiving emails. Not from the resistant ones. From those who had remained silent. The intern with long braids wrote to me asking if I would mentor her. She said she had ideas to improve customer service but never knew how to present them without being ignored. Accepted. We scheduled coffee every Tuesday morning. A junior analyst, a young black man in his 30s who worked in IT and whom I barely knew, showed up in my office with a complete automation project he had developed on his own, in his spare time, and which he had never shown to anyone because he thought it wouldn't be taken seriously. I read the entire project. It was brilliant. We implemented it in 3 months. He was promoted in 4. But it wasn't all roses. Sandra started spreading rumors. She said I was creating an exclusive club that only promoted people like me, that the company had traded one type of favoritism for another. The rumors reached the CEO. He called me in for a chat. Not out of distrust but out of curiosity. I showed him the numbers. The department's productivity had increased by 18%. New ideas had tripled. Projects that had been stalled for months were completed in weeks. And most importantly, turnover had dropped. People who had been requesting transfers to other departments suddenly wanted to stay. 'Cause for the first time they felt they had a voice. He looked at the data and smiled. He said that Sandra had resigned. That she couldn't stand working in an environment where results mattered more than appearances. I didn't feel pity. Felt relief. Because every person who left for not adapting to real meritocracy was an open position for someone who truly deserved to be there. Fernando was transferred. Not because I asked for it, but because when you shed light on processes that were previously done in the shadows, certain people simply can no longer operate. He was good at politics, terrible at production, and in a department where I measured real contribution, there was no room for someone who only pretended to be busy. 3 months after my promotion, the department looked completely different. Not because I had fired half the people, but because half the people had quit themselves. They couldn't function in a system where they could no longer steal credit, where they could no longer push work onto others and reap the rewards, where they could no longer survive solely on smooth talk and networking. And those who remained, they began to flourish. People I didn't even know existed were suddenly presenting projects, proposing solutions, leading meetings. An Asian woman in her 40s, who had worked in design for 7 years and had never been invited to participate in brainstorming sessions, created a visual campaign that increased our engagement by 32%. I asked her why she had never proposed that before. She replied that she had. Several times. But no one had listened. I listened. And I implemented. And I gave credit. And I made sure everyone knew where that brilliant idea came from. That's when I realized the true power of being in that position. It wasn't about revenge. Never was. It was about opening doors that were locked for people who had the key but no one would let them use it. It was about creating the kind of environment I had needed for 5 years and never had. It was about ensuring that the next black woman who joined that company wouldn't have to gather evidence for half a decade to be taken seriously. I started receiving messages from other branches. Women asking me how I had managed it, how I had endured it, how I had transformed humiliation into strategy. And I answered them all. Because I knew my story wasn't unique. It was just the one that had reached a public climax. How many others were happening at that moment in offices across the country? If you've ever been through something similar, if you've ever been invisible in a place that demanded your presence but denied your worth, leave a comment. Because these stories need to be told. They need to be heard. Not to generate anger, but to generate courage in those who are still keeping silent, gathering strength, waiting for their moment. 6 months after the audit, I received an invitation. The parent company wanted me to present my management model to all the other branches in Latin America. They wanted to transform what I had done in Brazil into a standard for the entire company. I, who 6 months earlier was the woman with the cotton candy hair, was now a continental benchmark for leadership. But before accepting, I made a demand. I wanted all the women and non-white people in the branches to be interviewed individually. I wanted to know how many were experiencing what I had experienced. How many had hidden talent. How many were being erased. Because if I was going to present a new model, I needed to ensure that it wouldn't just be implemented on paper. I needed to be sure that real change was happening. They accepted. And as I prepared for that presentation, I looked back and saw the path I had traveled. From jokes about my hair to leading the transformation of a continental company. And I thought about all the times I wanted to give up. All the times the silence weighed too heavily. All the times I thought that maybe they were right, that maybe I really wasn't good enough. But the numbers don't lie. The results don't lie. And finally, after so long being judged by everything but my competence, I had proven that I had always been exactly who I said I was. I just needed someone who had the courage to look. The presentation took place in Buenos Aires, in an auditorium with 200 people. Directors from all branches, regional managers, representatives from headquarters. I was on stage alone, with a microphone in my hand and a huge screen behind me projecting data I had compiled over months. Cold numbers that told warm stories. Graphs that showed wasted talent. Statistics that revealed patterns of exclusion so obvious that it was impossible to pretend not to see them. I started by telling my story. Not with self-pity. With facts. 5 years invisible. Stolen projects. Jokes disguised as compliments. And then I showed what happened when someone finally looked at the data instead of looking at my skin color or hair texture. 18% increase in productivity. 32% engagement. Turnover cut in half. But I didn't stop there. I showed the results of interviews the company had conducted in other branches. 63% of non-white women reported having their ideas ignored in meetings. 47% said they had seen their work credited to someone else. 81% said they had never been considered for promotions, even though they were more qualified than colleagues who were promoted. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Because numbers can't be countered with excuses. They can't be softened with, "That wasn't the intention," or "You're exaggerating." Numbers are cruel in their honesty. And those numbers were saying that the company had a systemic problem that cost millions in wasted talent. I ended the presentation with a challenge. I asked each person in the room to think of someone in their department who had unrecognized potential. Someone who always delivered but never received credit. Someone who had ideas but never had the opportunity to present them. And then I asked them to give that person a real chance. Not a performance-based chance. A genuine chance. With resources. With support. With deserved credit. I stepped off the stage not expecting applause. Because I didn't want to perform humility. I wanted to create discomfort. That kind of productive discomfort that forces people to look in the mirror and recognize what they were pretending not to see. 3 people approached me during the break. One was a director from Chile, a white woman in her 50s with red eyes. She said she had realized she was doing exactly what I had described. That she had a black analyst on the team who always brought solutions, but that she unconsciously ignored her, paying more attention to voices that sounded more familiar. She asked for advice on how to change. Gave it. A manager from Mexico, a black man older than me, thanked me. He said he had spent 30 years trying to prove his worth, and that for the first time someone had put into words what he had always felt but never been able to articulate. He said he would use my presentation as a basis for a conversation with his own board of directors. And a young Peruvian intern, indigenous, with frightened but determined eyes, asked me if one day she too could be on that stage. I looked at her and saw myself 25 years ago, full of dreams and fear in equal measure. Said yes, as she could, but that the path wouldn't be easy, that she would need to be twice as good to receive half the recognition, that she would need to keep evidence, that she would need strategic patience, and that in the end, if she didn't give up, she wouldn't just be on stage. She would be redefining who deserved to be there. I returned to Brazil on a Friday night. The plane was almost empty. I sat by the window and watched the city lights disappear below as we ascended. I thought of all the people who had listened to me, those who had recognized themselves in my story, those who had realized they were part of the problem, those who were still resisting, refusing to accept that they needed to change. And I thought about the Peruvian intern, about those frightened but determined eyes. Would she succeed? Would the system allow it? Or would she be where I was in 25 years, gathering evidence, keeping silent, waiting for the right moment? That question haunted me the entire flight. Because my individual victory didn't mean the system had changed. It only meant I had found a loophole and managed to get through. But what about the thousands of women who wouldn't be so lucky? Who wouldn't have a CEO willing to audit them? Who wouldn't work for companies large enough to have research resources? I had opened a door. But an open door doesn't mean much if there isn't a sustainable path on the other side. If every woman has to fight the same battle alone, gather the same evidence, wait the same 5 years, then I hadn't changed anything. I had only survived. And surviving wasn't enough. Not anymore. Because now that I had a voice, I had a responsibility. The responsibility to use that voice not only for myself, but for all those who were still silent. All those who were still being measured by the texture of their hair instead of the quality of their work. All those who were still invisible in rooms full of people. The plane landed. I grabbed my suitcase. I turned on my cell phone. I had 17 emails. Invitations to speak at conferences. Interview requests. Consulting proposals. My story had leaked beyond the company. It was becoming public. And with public visibility came something I hadn't foreseen. Exposure. Risk. The possibility that people who didn't like what they saw would try to discredit everything I had built. Because the truth about challenging systems is simple. The system doesn't die quietly. Fights back. And I was about to find out how. The counterattack began 2 weeks later. An article in a business magazine questioned whether my promotion had been based on merit or on political pressure from headquarters to improve diversity statistics. The text was carefully written, full of euphemisms and rhetorical questions, but the message was clear. I didn't deserve to be where I was. The article cited anonymous sources, former colleagues who said I had always been confrontational, that I had difficulty working in a team, that my rise had caused division in the department. I recognized the style. They were the same tactics used to silence competent women since forever. Questioning competence when you can't deny the results. Attacking character when the numbers speak for themselves. I read the article 3 times. Not angrily, strategically, because I knew this was just the beginning. When you tamper with power structures, power defends itself. And the first line of defense is always the same. to discredit anyone who dares to challenge them. Called the CEO. I asked if he had seen the article. He said yes. I asked if he believed what was written. He was silent for a few seconds. That kind of silence that speaks louder than words. And then he replied no. That numbers don't lie and that mine spoke too loudly to be ignored. But he also admitted something that chilled me. He said that the parent company was under pressure. That some shareholders were questioning the abrupt changes. That there were rumors that the company was prioritizing its social agenda over financial results. Social agenda. As if recognizing talent were charity. As if giving opportunities to those who have always been excluded were a favor and not a correction of historical injustice. I hung up the phone and looked out the window of my office. Down below, the city was bustling. Millions of people living their lives, fighting their battles, most of them invisible to the rest of the world. How many had stories similar to mine? How many were at that moment being questioned, discredited, having to prove their worth 1,000 times while others only had to prove it once? I decided to do what I always do. Document. I took all the reports from the last 8 months. I compiled data on productivity, engagement, innovation, and talent retention. I compared it with the same periods from previous years, when Marcela, Rodrigo, and Pedro were still in charge. The numbers were undeniable. Everything had improved. Not marginally. Significantly. I sent everything to the CEO with a simple message. If headquarters wants data, here it is. If they want to question my competence, let them question it based on facts, not anonymous sources who are afraid to put their names on what they say. He replied in 15 minutes. He said he was going to use that at the next meeting with the shareholders, and that I should prepare myself, because I would probably be called upon to present it in person. That night I couldn't sleep, not out of fear, but because of a strange mix of indignation and exhaustion. Indignation because even after everything, even with irrefutable evidence, I still needed to defend myself. Exhaustion because I realized this fight would never end. That each victory would be followed by a new challenge. That each open door would be tested by someone who wants to close it again. I thought about the braiding intern I was mentoring. She had shown me a project the previous week. Brilliant. Innovative. Exactly the kind of idea that would have been ignored if she had presented it to anyone else before me. I implemented it. I gave her full credit. I saw the smile on her face when I announced at the team meeting that the initiative had been hers. But then I thought, what if I wasn't there anymore? What if the counterattack worked? What if the parent company decided it was easier to return to the status quo than to deal with the pressure from conservative shareholders? That girl would become invisible again. And all the others I had helped emerge would return to the shadows. This possibility kept me awake at night more than any article could, because I finally understood that my battle was no longer just mine. It had become bigger. It had become a symbol. And symbols, when they fall, take hope with them. The next morning, I arrived at the office and found an envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside, a handwritten letter. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. It was from a woman who worked cleaning the building. She wrote that she saw me every day, that she had read about me, that she wanted to thank me. Not for me specifically, but for existing. For showing that people like them could occupy spaces that always seemed unreachable. She ended the letter saying that she had a 17-year-old daughter. That her daughter wanted to go to college but was afraid. Afraid of not fitting in. Afraid of being the only one. Afraid of going through what so many go through. But that after hearing my story, the girl had decided to try. Because if I could do it, maybe she could too. I read that letter 5 times. And I cried. Not from sadness. From a sense of responsibility. Because I realized that there were people I didn't even know placing their hopes in me. And that if I gave up, I wouldn't just be giving up on myself. I would be giving up on them too. I put the letter away in the drawer. And I decided that no matter how many articles were written, how many anonymous sources attacked me, how many shareholders questioned me, I wasn't going to back down. Because some battles aren't about personal victory. They're about paving the way for those who come after. And that path, I had sworn to myself, wouldn't be closed as long as I had the strength to keep it open. The meeting with the shareholders was scheduled for 2 weeks later. And I was going to arrive prepared, not just with data, but with the certainty that some battles are worth every scar they leave behind. The shareholders' meeting took place in a glass-walled room on the top floor of the headquarters in Sao Paulo. 16 people sat around a marble table. Men in dark suits, women in impeccable blazers, all with the posture of those accustomed to deciding the fate of thousands with a simple nod. I was the only black person in that room. The only one with curly hair. The only one who didn't seem to belong to that silent club of power. The CEO introduced me. He spoke of the results, the numbers, the transformation that had taken place under my leadership. But I saw it in their eyes. Skepticism. That polite doubt that well-mannered people use to disguise disbelief. As if my results were a coincidence. As if anyone could have done the same. Then one of the shareholders, a white-haired man with a watch that probably cost more than my car, asked the question everyone was thinking. How can we be sure that these results are sustainable? That they aren't just the consequence of a temporary adjustment phase? I could have responded with more numbers, more graphs, more projections. But I decided to do something different. I told the story of the cleaning lady, of the letter, of the 17-year-old daughter who had decided to try because I had shown her it was possible. And then I asked that room full of power, how much is a young woman worth who decides to believe in her own potential? How much is a talent worth that is no longer wasted? How much is a company worth where people work because they want to be there? Not because they have no better option. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't discomfort. It was reflection. Because I hadn't answered their question with cold, hard facts. I had answered with humanity. And humanity, I discovered at that moment, is the language that even those in power understand when they have no choice. One of the shareholders, a woman in her 60s who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. She said she had a granddaughter, that the girl had just graduated in business administration but was afraid to enter the market. Afraid of not being taken seriously. Afraid of spending years proving value that should be obvious. And that after listening to me, she understood this fear better. And more importantly, she understood the cost of ignoring it. The meeting ended with a decision. The company would not only maintain the changes, but expand them to all branches globally. And I would be responsible for leading this expansion. Not as an external consultant, but as Vice President of Culture and Talent for the entire international operation. I left that room and, for the first time in months, I let the tears fall. Not in front of them, but in the empty elevator, descending 40 floors back to the ground. Tears of exhaustion, of relief, of victory that seemed impossible 6 months ago when I was just the woman with the different hair listening to muffled laughter. I returned to the office the next day, and the first thing I did was look for the intern with the braids. I told her everything. The meeting, the challenge, the response, the promotion. And then I said what needed to be said. That 20 years from now, when someone writes about corporate transformations, my name might appear. But the real legacy wouldn't be mine. It would be hers. And all the others who would come after. Because I had opened the door. But it was they who would ensure that it never closed again. She hugged me. And in that hug I felt the weight and the lightness of everything that had happened. The weight of responsibility. The lightness of shared victory. Today, 3 years after that meeting in the Buenos Aires auditorium, I lead a global program that has already identified and promoted more than 200 talents who were previously invisible. 200 people who had competence but no voice. Who had potential but no space. Who were measured by everything except what really mattered. And if you've made it this far, if you've heard this whole story, it's because it touched you in some way. Maybe because you've lived through something similar. Maybe because you know someone who is going through it now. Maybe because you finally understood that wasted talent isn't just an individual loss. It's a collective tragedy that impoverishes us all. If this story resonated with you, please like it. Because every gesture like this is a vote of confidence in narratives that need to be told. Comment on what you felt, what you learned, what changed in the way you see spaces of power. And if you want to continue following stories of people who transformed humiliation into strategy, invisibility into protagonism, subscribe to this channel. Because this isn't just my story. It's the story of everyone who refuses to accept that where they were born or the color of their skin defines how far they can go. My name finally matters. Not because I'll become a position of power, but because I'll become a bridge. And bridges don't exist for those who build them. They exist for those who need to cross them. Cross them. And now I spend my days ensuring that other people can too. Because in the end, we are not measured by what we achieve. We are measured by how many doors we leave open when we depart. And those doors, they will remain open, no matter how many try to close them. Because once you prove that the impossible is possible, it ceases to be impossible. It becomes merely a matter of time. And time, when you have strategic patience, always works in favor of those who are on the right side of history.